When we're setting up these proportions, right, these proportions are only a portion of the pattern. Now they're useful for setting exactly that in terms of like how long something is, how big something is, right, et cetera, right? But it doesn't do very much in terms of giving us an idea of what, one area or another actually looks like. So whether or not you're dealing with the leg from the front or the back, it would have been nice if I hadn't put this thing in here just yet. Oh, look at that. That actually looks. Right, that's still going to be your basic proportion and your basic shape. And then same thing if we're looking at it from a profile. Are you so tilted? And again, the analogy of that ball for the knee, right, works really well in terms of treating the knee as a volume, right, that interrelates with the upper leg and the lower leg the same way that the pelvis interrelates with the torso and the upper leg. Now, when we come down to the base of the leg, either in a bent position or in a straight position, right, we can think about the foot as being something roughly triangular. Now, we're going to be going over what the leg looks like, or whether what the foot looks like in much greater detail in the very near future. Just from the front and the back, think about the foot as something like this. From the profile and basically every other position for right now, just think about the foot as something like this. These are structurally reflective of what's happening with the foot, and will be easier to change into things that are more reflective of the foot in terms of detail, right? And significantly better than any other version that you might have just as a stand-in for the foot. Okay, so this is where the leg starts to begin with. Now, certain patterns emerge, right, about the leg. Most specifically and most importantly, right, is that the outside of the leg, both from the front and the back, you want to think about the outside of the leg as having a curve to it. Now, this is a simplification, especially as it gets into the pelvic area, but we want to think about that curve as being a long, slow curve that adds to this straight box a little bit of volume, but also a certain pattern. And that pattern is that there is a curve here, whereas the inside of the leg seems relatively straight by comparison. Now, again, this is a simplification. This isn't meant to make the leg look exactly like the leg. It's meant to capture something that's going to give you a little bit more volume out here and make it a little bit easier to add stuff inside of all of this that makes that leg look a little bit more accurate. Likewise, if we have it from a profile, from both the inside and the outside of the leg. This is where this other proportion, right, of coming from here to the top of the pelvic girdle becomes important. Whether or not you're dealing with it from the sacrum, right, or you're dealing with it from the pelvic plate, doesn't matter, right? Because you have a series of muscles that start up here that we'll get into that basically now start up here, but then contribute, or sorry, turn direction, right, and contribute to the curve that's on the top of the leg. Right, so the top of the leg always carries a curve, while the bottom of the leg, by comparison, right, tends to be a little bit more straight. And so one way of thinking about this, and this is of limited use in this regard, right, is that you have a slightly complex side of the pose in the sense that this is more difficult to put in than this, versus a really simple side of the pose. You also have a curved line, right, versus a straight line, right? So whether the S, right, stands for simple or straight, or the C stands for curved or complex, this is a nice way of thinking about one side versus the other side of the pose. And this is very similar to what your squash and your stretch do. The squash accentuates that stretch. That stretch accentuates the squash. A curve accentuates a straight line and vice versa, right? So even just on some sort of like, I don't know, what would you call it? Abstract formal design principle level, these different structural characteristics start to accentuate each other. So when we put in this initial proportion, this is something that becomes pretty easy to do, right, early on, right? And you can basically put in at that structural level before you start, breaking things up and slowing things down, right, into more distinct anatomical reference. Basically, that's just another way of saying that this shape here is just as easy to put in as that shape there. And so once you know this pattern, right, this becomes easy to do. Now, likewise, just as this starts here, we want to make sure that that curve comes down and feels like it wraps around the base of that knee. We don't want this to feel like it stops short of the knee. Reason being is that, right, in your knee, right, you can think about your knee as kind of being divided up in half, right? And your patella, aka kneecap, basically sits here. And then your femur basically sits in behind that, something like that. And then you have a tendon that comes up off of there. Well, your kneecap or your quad comes down and attaches, right, to this. That's what this curve is here. But just as importantly is that you have, right, a series of tendons, right, that come down that are part of your hamstring that come down and attach to the head of your tibia. Right? This is what, right, so this is coming down and attaching to your lower leg. This is what, even though your quad attaches here, this is the relationship that we're trying to fake by doing this, so that your knee feels just as much a part of your upper leg and your pelvis as your calf is going to feel like a part of your upper leg. Because your calf is going to do exactly the same thing. You're going to have a curve on the outside that comes up and then feels like it wraps around that knee. And then as opposed to coming down and wrapping around an ankle, you want to try and take that shape or that curve, right, and then migrate it and twist it around to the inside of the foot. And the inside of the foot, you'll find, is directly in line with the inside of the knee and the inside of quad. Okay, so this is why we're trying to treat this as a straight line from the inside of the leg at an early stage, and your lower leg as something that comes in from the outside. Is because of the spiraling nature of the lower leg, of which we'll get into, right, in due course. So that means from the inside, right, we're characterizing the shin as this stiff line, which characterizes the stiffness of bone, which is a really nice characterization because I kind of keep using this word, right, right, for that particular area. When we're looking at the leg from a profile, both from the inside and the outside, the same sort of analogy of this, the calf coming up and wrapping around the back of the knee is going to be important. And that curve for the lower leg, now it happens on the back of the leg and basically cuts through that lower leg, this initial shape. And if you were to continue it straight through, would basically, as a movement, hook up the top of the foot. So basically what I'm doing here is using these simple shapes here and adding just this amount of information to it. Here and here, here, and here, right? To make it feel a little bit more leg-like. You know, obviously there's a lot more, right, to go into that. But this is the beginning of those characteristics, because what this starts to do is set up a relationship, right, between, that's most obviously presented here. As soon as you have this dip here, you can now start to identify that dip in relationship to that bulge there. And as long as the angle relationship between these 2 points here is correct, you're going to get an accurate volume and an accurate structure out of the knee. The same sort of thing is going to start to occur here. Whereas this dip here is going to be at a certain angle from the dip on the inside of the knee. That's going to occur slightly lower than it. Okay, so as long as the inside of the knee and the outside of the knee have this dip-dip relationship of high outside, low inside, then the front and the back of the leg are going to start to make a little bit more sense. Okay, so just like we're faking this effect here, right, with this shape with the upper leg, what we're faking with the lower leg, right, and making sure that this comes up, is that if you look at your femur from a profile, this is what your femur looks like. Oops. Behave. That's what your femur looks like, and your kneecap basically sits right in front of it. And then both of those things sit on top of your tibia. But your calves come up and attach onto the back of that little ball of the femur. And so when we're doing this, or when we're doing this, what we're doing is faking this much more complicated structural effect, but which gets it across in a really simple manner. So Paris, would you mind firing up your camera feed and just taking on a pose something like this? And I'll just do a quick demonstration of this in terms of how this relates to the gesture, etc. Oh, snack time. Hi, Arwen. How are you feeling? Arwen was sick yesterday. She feeling better? Yeah. Well, she certainly looks like she's feeling better. Hi. That's Arwen, everybody. Look, Arwen and her mom have the same haircut. It's cute. All right, get out of here. Keep that kid off the camera. Okay, so screenshot this while you've got the opportunity. Okay, and I'm just going to quickly show how this integrates into your gesture and your proportions. I mean, I've already kind of shown it because I've already kind of done it. Your turn to shine, Paris. 2 minutos, please. 2. But the other leg frontal, please. The standing leg, yes, perfect. Okay, so gesture doesn't change, basic structure doesn't change. The patterning of this doesn't change. Right? This is more difficult than it sounds like to keep straight because the natural reaction again is going to be to want to get more complex as the pose length gets longer. You need to simplify this stuff early on. This is going to be even more important as the pose lengths get, or as the poses get more complicated. You can probably get away with it in simple poses, right? But when we start to get into foreshortening and other stuff, the more that practice that you have in terms of seeing shapes simply, the better. Okay, so now the job is to basically take that stuff and correct its proportions, right? So I'm starting to reorient my pelvis, find the perspective twist of the pelvis by placing the center line closer towards one side of the torso and those proportions than the other, breaking up the pelvis right into that halfway point so that I can get a sense of where this leg starts, especially from the profile, right? And then because I know this is the pattern, right, I just put in that curve straight away. Likewise, building on this shape here, this shape becomes a really useful ground line or ground shape for that shape. And so basically what I'm doing is just adding the stuff that's necessary to what is already there so that this shape serves as a really useful foundation for this relationship. Right? And then that's going to serve as an additional really useful relationship for all of the other relationships that we go over. So even when we start to get into the more developed aspects of the leg, in terms of where all the other musculature goes, right, and why the silhouette edge moves the way that it does, right, everything else you can see falls into the same sort of category. Whereas I'm just adding the stuff that is necessary to what I already have, correcting proportions as is necessary, rather than changing the process altogether. So in a way, the analogy of this is better served as thinking about the pose as building the pose, right, from the inside out, as opposed to, right, outlining the pose. In Paris, could we do the exact same pose but from reverse? Your ankle's cut off. Perfect, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so again, line of action, shoulders, hips, stretch, squish, simple shape, simple shape, simple shape, etc. Right, reestablish proportion. My pencil is drying out. Right, reestablishing, right, the torso as well, putting the curve of the spine in now. Right, that's particularly important from the back. Identifying where the top of the pelvic girdle is, because that's particularly important from the back as well. Right, because you can see is like how the glutes come up higher right? The leg extends from slightly lower, right? But then that curve of the upper leg is still there. The lower leg, right, still has this overall curve. Outside of the leg has the curve, both above and below. The patterning from the back of the leg is a little bit different. We're going to get into this after the break in terms of how we then add in the additional chunks of information that are necessary in order to make this thing feel a little bit more leg-like. Right? But again, importantly, right, it's just based on those initial shapes, and all I'm doing is complicating those shapes by adding more and more stuff to it. But I'm not changing anything about the process of how I put those initial shapes down. Right? And this is going to be the same for when I start to add detail to the pose. Those shapes will then start to guide how any sort of individual detail in terms of their graphic overlap, reference to shade and shadow, right, or more specific bulges, dips, right, et cetera, start to occur. Okay, so let's give that a go. Gesture structure the same as is usual, right, but now start to incorporate these curves, right, into your sketch, right, for their proportional section. Paris will just go back into 2-minute poses, please. Please try to limit the foreshortening right, that we might experience in the pose. Thank you much. Okay, gang, let's see your feeds and shares again. General characteristics of the leg. Again, this is just a pattern that you can chuck in without having to think too much about it, and that characterizes all legs. So that because of that, you don't have to worry about who it is that you're drawing, right, or what position it is that you're drawing it in, right? You basically just kind of like rinse and repeat. So 4 major positions of the leg. Again, we can't think about the leg as being separate from the pelvis. Right? So we need that locked into position to begin with. And whether or not you're looking at it from, that's a good way to do this. No, we'll do it like this. Well, got the ringing in the ears, especially pronounced right now. That's another octave I'll never hear again. Awesome. I really want to squeeze this into. Yes. Oh, so close. Okay, so let's call this front, back, inside, outside. Yeah, Dominic, don't worry about Raphael right now. He's not doing modeling sessions until he either gets a different living situation or things go back into in person. He still wants to model, but his living situation doesn't allow for him to model. So,
noted.
Yeah, but thanks for pursuing that. He contacted me independently the other day.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Okay, so at the halfway point here, again, we got your spine and your center line. Okay, so we still need to find that stuff, right, so that we can find the sacrum and your pelvic plate. We need this 3/4 mark, right, as a way of extending that pelvic girdle. That's a good habit to get into. And also that pelvic plate, or rather that shape here, is going to be really useful for us in terms of like establishing another shape inside here that's circular that we can use not only as an analogy for the pulley of the upper leg, but also as a way of extending the gluteal groups from the curvature of the rib cage into the lower back, right, and then into the bulge of the glutes there, right? So that becomes a useful thing to put in. Again, building off of the basic proportion and shape of the box for the upper leg, the tapering nature of the lower leg. This is all the same. regardless of the position that the leg is in, from the front or the back, right? And regardless of whether or not you break it up into one shape, two shapes, or treat it as a single shape, proportions obviously remain the same. And that shape remains exactly the same from a profile as well. We've already done this. Curve here from the front, curve here from the back. When we get into a profile, both from the inside and the outside, curve on the front, again, that curve starting at the top of the pelvis. There is a little bit of a dip here, and then it starts to curve out, right? So that dip kind of comes down to that halfway mark, right? And then that curve starts to bulge out. That's going to be exactly the same from both inside and outside. Again, making sure that this curve wraps around the front of the knee. Curve now happens on the back of the leg, right? Wraps around the calf, right? And then comes through, or sorry, wraps around the knee and then comes through the leg to represent the top of the foot. This, for the profile of your leg, is all you need to do. Right? This basically solves the lower leg entirely. And so everything else that we put on top of this will literally just be a gloss in terms of detail, because this already feels leggy. And then the most important part about this is that in terms of a graphic interface, it's a little bit more complicated than this, but think about your calves. They have to go behind your hamstrings structurally. Okay, so in terms of an overlap, this has to occur here from both the inside and the outside. It cannot work the other way because the muscles don't do that. Okay, so that's one major thing to think about. The other major thing to think about is that if we're doing this properly by bringing this up like this so that it wraps around the knee, and bringing this down like this so that it wraps around the knee, it creates a natural high back, low front. This basically mimics what's happening with the kneecap quite naturally, right? So the kneecap, in terms of that knee shape, is basically sitting here on the front. Right? Hamstrings coming in over like this, calves going in behind like that. This naturally occurs there. So as long as this structural relationship here is consistent, this will feel accurate. There is no overlap here like this, right? So don't get into the habit of doing this in terms of a graphical interface. Right? It's significantly more complicated than that, right? And we're not going to get into it, right? But what is important, right, is that this occurs. Now, likewise, from both the front and the back, just like you have from the front and back here, just like you have a high back, low front here, you have a similar type of relationship from the front. When you look at the quads, your quads are basically divided up into three different chunks. You have an outside quad that starts at about here and curves down, and then this is all gluteal stuff. We can simplify that again into a single curve. And then you have an inside quad. And if you think about that, again, the knee as having a halfway point, this volume is having a knee and this volume being representative of the knee, and that knee having that volume having a halfway point, your kneecap sits on the upper half of it. And the interior quad, the medial quad, is a curve that sits inside this straight line. And that curve always sits, the apex of that curve always sits higher than the apex of the outside curve. So you have a high outside, low inside relationship. And that's always going to be the same. And likewise, as your hamstrings start to overlap your calves from the front, you have another muscle that starts right about here, in line with the bottom section of your pelvic plate. And that basically comes all the way from here to the inside of your knee, and then wraps around and attaches to the front of your tibia, which divides this whole space up into kind of like a big teardrop shape, with a curve occurring here, a curve occurring here, high outside, low inside, and then this creating a graphical relationship with the lower leg that sits like that. Okay, so this line and this line have to interrelate with each other like this just like this line and this line have to interrelate with each other like that. This section here represents the outside of the quad, or sorry, the outside of the calf. This line here represents the shin. Right now, there is a bit of a curve to the shin, but we can ignore that right now for simplicity's sake. Then the little bit of the calf that you can see from the front basically is a little triangular wedge that pops out from behind that shin like that to create, again, this high outside, low inside relationship. Because of this relationship between the outside of the hamstrings and the inside of the knee, the dip of the knee also has a high outside, low inside relationship. So this is the pattern that you're trying to put in from the front. Right? That pattern is exactly the same from the back, with the exception that now the calves, you can change the calves rather than thinking about it like this. You can change the calves into another shape that you're overlaying over top of this initial volume and this initial curve, and treat it basically as an ellipse that wraps around the top of the knee and comes down to the halfway point of that lower leg. Right, so that creates the volume that would represent our calves. Your calves are a congregation of a bunch of different muscles that all work really well with the combination of shapes that we're using. One muscle is this initial shape that's going underneath this other volume. And between those two things, represent the calves relatively accurately. But here, your calves have to go in front of your hamstring, right? So now the graphical interface is reversed. Likewise, this muscle here, as well as all of your hamstrings, then come down and wrap around the knee, go to the front of the leg, and then create the exact same sort of graphic interface. And so those things have to overlap each other like that. Now what we've left out is basically what the hamstrings are doing. Your hamstrings essentially go underneath your gluteal groups, and there's 4 of them that basically create one big volume right here. Right? And then start to thin out, split right roughly down the middle, and then go to either side of your calves. The belly of all 4 of those things basically is treated as one big volume, and they all kind of sit right there. What that does is it changes the volume of the leg a little bit right here and adds a little bit of a curve. That volume also occurs here. And so when you want to add a little bit of bulk to the hamstrings, a couple of things become obvious. If we're looking at that from the inside, your hamstrings bulge here, right, and then flatten out into that tendon. There are no glutes for this to go underneath, right? So this is going to be something that, you know, we'll deal with at another point. But for right now, we can basically treat as just that volume. You can also treat this diagonal here as another nice way of breaking this shape up into something that feels a little bit more leggy, because this muscle is visible from the inside, breaks this space up into your quads and what are called your adductors. Adductors are muscles that bring the leg in to the body, as opposed to abductors, which are glutes, which bring your muscles, your leg away from the body, literally abducted, to take away. Okay, so this thing and this overlap here combine into a single shape that help to break this up. This curve here sits higher than the curve on the front of the leg. So as long as that bulge is there and this bulge is here, and that apex, the apex of those bulges relate to each other in this formulaic way, then this will work fine. But again, I'm adding this little chunk of space to this initial shape. If you're going to err on the side of caution, don't do this. Right? You don't need it as a way of characterizing what the leg looks and feels like. This bulge occurs in exactly the same space from the outside. The only difference is that from the outside, your glutes, right, your butt muscle, has to overlap that there, just like your hamstrings have to overlap your calves there. The bulge of these hamstrings and your quads exist in exactly the same high back, low front. Okay, so that's the pattern, right, that we're using, as well as how those things build on top of each other. Right, so screenshot this because there's a whole bunch of interpretation that goes along with this, as well as other things that we're eventually going to add to this. But this is the basic breakup of this. Even the stuff that we're going to add to this, the interpretation of these shapes, is going to be based on these shapes, right? And the more familiar you get with these things, the better. What should we do? Paris. Again, we do the same pose that we did at the end of the first half of the class. From the front, for about 2 minutes. And then we're going to change that pose slightly at about the 2 minute mark and do it for another 2 minutes. Got a ham sandwich in my eye again. What's going on with my eyes? There's always some sort of lunch material in my eyes. Ringing in my ears, ham sandwich in my eyes. It's a good time. Yeah, and then that, yes, exactly. Okay, so this should be quick and dirty, right? And this is stuff that you can put down inside your gestural section, right, as you get more familiar with it, because as you start to put this stuff down, right, this relationship here and this relationship here start to become pretty standard stuff. Just like this becomes standard stuff, that becomes standard stuff, that becomes standard stuff, all of that stuff is standard stuff, right? And then as we start to exaggerate this, now what I'm looking for is I know that this curve has to exist there, this shape has to exist here, this bulge exists there, that bulge exists there, right? And that bulge exists there, right? And at a certain point, you'll notice that I'm just looking at my piece of paper, right? Once I know the position that the legs are in, I don't need to look at the legs anymore because the legs are all structured exactly the same way. Right? So that's when your gesture and your structure become easier, right? Because all of this shit is exactly the same, regardless of who's posing, right? If the position of the leg is the same, then everything else, right, follows. Now, how do we interpret this? Paris, would you mind keeping your standing leg in the same position, but changing your pose so that the leg that's bent, the knee is pointing more towards the camera? Perfect. All right, so what do we do with that irritating piece of business? Right. Well, basically what we do with that, right, is exactly the same shit, right? Except now the formula isn't quite as easy. The initial gesture is exactly the same. The only difference is there's a proportional difference, right? Because this leg doesn't extend out quite as far. This leg remains exactly the same. And one way of making the pose easier to draw is draw the stuff that's easy first. Sounds kind of stupid, right? But is, a truism, right? And truisms exist for a reason, right? Where I'm just putting in the formula of this leg, right? And as a result of having more and more information there, I now have something that has more information that I can compare over to here. So for instance, like I know where the leg has to end because I can tell that this foot is about in this vertical position relative to that knee. Right? I can also tell that the knee here, right, as I draw this unforeshortened torso, right, and pelvis, right, and in addition to, right, drawing the hand, I can tell that the hand has to be right about here because it's about this far away from the torso, which makes it easier to position because this space here is pretty easy to guesstimate, which means that because the hand has to be on top of the knee, I can now draw that knee in this relationship to that hand. Because the knee still needs to be attached to the hip, this simple leg now has to be there proportionally. So now this three-dimensional leg is attached to, right, that two-dimensional pelvis. Because this foot has to be here in the angle of, pencil malfunction, this lower leg has to now be there in relationship to that. Now I have to basically take this, the top of the leg still has to have a curve. The lower leg still has to overlap right? Or sorry, the hamstring still has to overlap the calf in much the same way. The hamstring, as I spontaneously develop a lisp, the hamstring still has to develop there. And this relationship still has to exist, except now it's not high back, low front. I now have this relationship here. So I'm still comparing apexes of curves to each other in order to, right, in order to make sure that the relationship of top and bottom, front and back exists with each other. Your calf now, the outside of the calf has a curve here that I can see a little bit of. Inside of the calf now bulges out here as a way of accentuating this relationship, and the calf still has to go behind the hamstring. So while it's not going to look exactly like this, it's going to look close enough, right, to what it is that we need, right? Because the leg is in a bit of a 3/4 position here, which isn't quite as straightforward as drawing as if it's in a straight frontal position. Okay, so that's the interpretive aspect of it. How does this thing incorporate here? Well, that thing just comes down like that and starts to divide this up, right, into two individual shapes, which makes it easier for me to do shit like this, which we'll do in due course, right? Change the overall volume of the leg into something that appears a little bit more reflective of its actual contour. Paris, could we do the exact same thing but from reverse now? Pretty please. Perfect. Okay, so again, here's the formula. That's the really basic stuff, right? Now the basic stuff, again, is really useful because it makes more complicated stuff easier to draw. So don't shy away from the easy stuff. The easy stuff is, it's your bread and butter. It's what you want in your poses because it makes doing this and doing this and doing this and doing this and doing this almost mindless, right? Where you don't have to think about it anymore. All you need to do is make sure that you're capturing the pattern that has to exist for all legs. Same thing from a profile. Sun-dappled sketch pad that I have. Curve up here, curve here, that in existence like that. Simple shape here, making sure that these things overlap in the way that you now know that they have to, even if that doesn't appear that way, right? So this line only extends this far, but that's accurate in terms of its structural relationship. This has to go behind that. This has to go behind that. So Paris, could you take your bent knee now and point it away from the camera a little bit? Too much. Paris, that knee's too much away from the camera? Maybe a little bit less, 45 degrees maybe? Perfect, thank you. Okay, so again, draw the easy stuff first. Okay, and now finding your proportion of that hamstring, simplify the upper leg right into a box with just less length to it. Simplify the lower leg right into that. Again, finding the sacrum. Curve here, bulge there, both wrapping around the knee. Volume of the calf, accentuating how the structure of the leg has to interrelate at that point. This area now, this glute still has to overlap the hamstring. This glute still has to overlap the quad. The top of the quad still has a curve to it, it's just less long. This hamstring still has to overlap the calf. The calf from this position is going to be useful to think about as a volume like that. You're going to see a little bit of the curve of the outside of the leg because we've got a little bit of a 3/4 position shown. This initial shape here still defines this area there. Right? Now, this, again, is only serving as a guide for more particular stuff. Right? So these aren't details. These are a way of guiding details. Right? Because my hamstrings are going to be a little bit more like that. This is going to be a little bit more complex. Right? As is everything else, right, that we're going to draw in this class. Right? So the purpose isn't to avoid complexity, right, by doing this. The purpose is to make the complexity easier to deal with because you've got something that you can base this stuff on. Thank you, Paris. That was great. Okay, so what we're going to do, right, is we're going to move into some 5-minute drawings, right? And Paris is going to control her poses so that one leg is in an easy position to draw, right? And the other leg is in a slightly irritating position to draw. Not super irritating, Paris. So not like, again, bonkers foreshortening, right? But, you know, in a little bit of a foreshortened position, right? 3/4, one way or the other, right? A little bit raised, a little bit, right, plunging, right, etc. But no feet pointed directly at the camera or directly away from the camera or anything like that. Pretty please. Okay, thus ends the sermon. Do you guys have any questions before I continue? We continue as a group. It's a collective effort. Niet. Niet. I have no questions.
You guys don't want to ask about points of insertion where the glutes meet the hamstrings? I mean, I'm just speaking out loud here.
Sorry, what are the insertions for? What's the insertion for the glutes and the hamstrings?
Yeah.
Well, it's a big question. But if you think about, we'll get into this further towards the end of the course, but for right now, you can think about your pelvis as basically looking like this from the back. And your femur locking into that position there, right? And your pelvis, right, has 3 different parts to it. You have your ilium, your pubis, and your ischium. All of your glutes attach along your ischium, right? So your gluteus medius is here, your TFL is there, and your gluteus maximus is there. Your gluteus maximus from the back looks like this, right? So it attaches all the way along the sacrum and along your iliac crest, right? And then comes down and attaches to the outside of your leg via a common tendon called your IT band that all 3 of these things move into, and that's what attaches to the outside of your leg, right, at the head of your tibia, right? So your medius is doing this, right? This is just obviously not outside the body like that, but has been exaggerated, right, for my purposes. Right, so your gluteus medius is coming out like that. Your hamstrings, for our purposes right now, think about them as attaching to the underside of your pubis, or sorry, the underside of your ischium, right? And what's important about that is that because they all start here, they all have to go underneath this, which sits on top of them. And to get any more granular about it right now, it's not going to help, right? So there's no real point. But in terms of where they attach, or that's the important part. In terms of where they, in terms of where they insert their origin point, right? That's where they insert. Your IT band attaches, if this is the front of your knee, your IT band attaches here to the front of your tibia, right? So that's where that thing is going. So if you look at it in profile, that happens like that, and that whole thing comes down and does that there from the outside. If you directly in behind there, your hamstrings come in and attach to the head of your fibula. And so your tibia and fibula look like this from the front. Your hamstrings attached there from the outside. And from the inside, your hamstrings are a complex piece of business that if this is your knee, your sartorius comes down, that's that big triangular dividing muscle, comes down and does this. And then a muscle called your gracilis comes in and attaches directly underneath it. And then both hamstrings from the inside come down and attach directly underneath that. So they all come and attach to the front of your tibia as well. So this is useful stuff to know. I'm not going to deny it, but this is what we're faking with these much simpler structures. This is something that you can safely ignore inside 2 minutes and 3 minutes, or 2 minutes and 5 minutes, as long as you've got these overall relationships. This flushes out how this stuff works and why we use these individual shapes, but is effectively unnecessary in order to communicate the structural consistency of those things.
That's rad. Thank you.
That's what I aim for. I aim for radness. I aim for radness in all aspects of my life. Yes. Check that box for the day. Okay, Miss Paris, how do you feel about doing some 5-minute poses? Yay. All right, so for these 5-minute poses, gesture the same way that you have been, structure the same way that you have been for really basic structure. As soon as we start getting into more complicated stuff, concentrate on the legs first, legs and pelvis first, then go up into the torso, right? So legs, pelvis first, then torso, right? Proportional, structural, all of that jazz, pattern, etc. If you've got time left over, then do the arms, right? And head last of all, right? So this is all that we care about for right now. Torso is a bonus. Arms and head and stuff like that, right? That's gravy on the proverbial pudding, because that's where everybody likes their pudding, is with gravy on it. All right. It's a gross thought, isn't it? Pumpkin pie and gravy. Delicious. Let's take this into the third dimension, as it were. We've already done a little bit of that. In terms of, say, that last pose, for instance, overlapping the pelvis and the torso, right, while still trying to capture the squash and stretch by changing the pelvis and the torso shape, right, and starting to conceptualize them differently, right, where pelvis, right, as it dips forward or backward in space, right, physically becoming something that looks kind of like that, right, but also incorporating the bulge of the glutes over top of it, and as a result, forcing the pelvic plate someplace down here, right, and then that torso also moving forward in space if we're looking at it three-dimensionally, or sorry, as that cube, something along those lines, or as that rib cage, right? In either way, that's going to help to position your pelvis and your torso relative to each other, right, as they start to overlap each other, and also change the overall volumes that we're dealing with. And as I recommended last day, is like, if you can do anything outside of this class, is to start practicing drawing these shapes, right, in perspective, right, as a way of starting to kind of get a sense of, all right, well, what does a rib cage look like when it starts to shift into position, this position, or into a perspectively distorted position. And regardless of its position, we kind of start to get a sense of how we can control that shape as it comes forward, moves away, etc. Now, with the legs take on a couple of different possibilities. One really simple version of the leg is going to be cylindrical. Right? Another almost equally simple version of a leg is going to be relatively conical. Another useful way of thinking about the leg, depending on its position and the context, right, is going to be some sort of rectilinear shape. And then equally useful is this thing kind of rammed in with that thing or this thing as a way of creating some sort of domey type shape. And again, if we can think about the leg, right, as being one of those shapes, as a leg starts to disappear in perspective, right, we're going to be much more likely to be able to draw that thing as a simplified shape in those multiple different positions. Because in this instance here, right, I can now get an idea of where the knee is going to be, where that sartorius is going to be, that diagonal line is going to be, where the curve of the quad is going to be, and then everything else that we do in terms of the individual shapes now start to be able to be grafted in over top of that. So we go from something like this to something like this relatively quickly. So for instance, one of the poses that we did in the first half of the class, if this is my leg plunging in perspective, well, then I can overlap the extra volume of my pelvic girdle over top of that, and now lay in the gluteal groups over top of that. I get a sense of the hamstring now having to be underneath that glute, right? A sense of the curvature of the quad having to go in behind that pelvic girdle and one of those glute muscles that I was talking about beforehand, and then use the whatchamacallit, the rectilinearity, I suppose, right, of the front of that initial geometric shape as a way of providing a guideline for where the front of the kneecap is going to be. The bottom of this box also is providing a guideline for where the tendons of the leg are going to be. Right now, again, this takes, you know, some getting used to, right? Not only just in terms of being able to draw this stuff prospectively, right, but also to apply it. And there's easier ways and more difficult ways of applying this. One easy way of doing this, let's say we take this leg, right, and you want a slightly more user-friendly way to put this. Let's say that this is your pelvis. Again, draw the easy stuff first. Right, so that pelvis, right, kind of looking something like this. Etc. Well, if the leg is going down in this direction, my gesture can be something like this, and I can treat it two-dimensionally, and the leg coming down like this, I can treat that somewhat two-dimensionally. It's useful to think about the leg as a series of planes. So the bottom of the leg can be coming down like this. If we just think about the bottom of the leg as a simple two-dimensional plane. Right? And that bottom of the leg, it stands to reason, is coming off the bottom of that pelvis. Right? So that makes drawing that chunk of perspective a bit easier. The back of the leg, likewise, can just be treated as another plane. Now that's now changing direction and coming towards you, right, along that angle. We're not really thinking about perspective yet at this point. All we're thinking about here is drawing this direction and this direction, and the only difference is that you're adding a little bit of volume to both of those directions. Now, if this is then changing direction, this is the usefulness of thinking about this as a three-dimensional shape. Well, one direction is going like this. The other direction is now coming up like this in a simplified form. So I can think about this now as being another shape that now we know has to start at the top of that pelvic girdle, come down and now extend beyond that flat section of the back of the leg, because the side of the leg now has to have volume as well. But just like this is a volume going that direction and a plane going in this direction, same thing here. And now this plane is just going in that direction. So now all of a sudden we've got something that's roughly three-dimensional. Now we're in the business of putting this in, putting this in, putting that in, putting this in, putting that in, right? And then having those things flow around it like water in the sea. in order to develop that into the leg. Okay, so again, as devastatingly simple as I know that I'm making that seem, this takes, you know, time in order to figure things out. What this is ultimately introducing, though, is the idea of the pose not only as three-dimensional, but as having planes. Right? Planes is a useful way of thinking about it when we're dealing with rectilinear surfaces. Right? You got a plane going this way, you got a plane going that way. The change in planes helps to identify volume in the pose. Those planes are going to be useful in a shape like this, where I've got a plane going this way, I've got a plane going that way. But it's not useful when I'm thinking about shapes like this. What's useful when you're thinking about shapes like that is contour lines. So a contour line is basically like if you could take a Jiffy marker and just draw on the outside of any one of the single body parts, you would be forced to draw around the three-dimensionality of that particular thing. So these types of contour lines are yet another way of starting to abstractly conceptualize, right, what the form is underneath the surface, right? Because that contour line is going to start to dictate what the overall topography of the form looks like. So for instance, as I come over top of this leg, generally speaking, right, in a relaxed position, I'm going to get a contour that looks like this until it hits a particular muscle. Then once it hits that muscle, it's going to change direction when it hits the bulge of the hamstrings. So if I've got, just blow that up for illustrations purposes. If I've got a really simple version of a leg going out in this direction, one really simple version of that contour is this. That's one way of making sure that your foreshortening starts to make a little bit more impact, and also another way of making that have volume. Now, when I start to complicate this, I say adding in where my pectoral girdle has to be, right? Where my glutes are, where my gluteus medius, maximus, right? All of that jazz is. Where the exterior quad is, what the bulge of the top of the quad is, where the bulge of the hamstrings are, what the tendons of the hamstring are, right? As they come down and interlock, right, with the calf, all of that stuff being based on things like this or based on things like this. What we're ultimately doing is now introducing new contours. Whereas like that shape now becomes something more like that. This shape, if I was drawing a contour over it like this, might be something like this. Or if I was coming down in this direction, that contour might be something like this, identifying the dip over top of that area. As I come in this area, and that contour might be something really complicated like that. The point being is that this becomes another way of starting to develop an idea of what's happening in the pose that's going to be more or less useful depending on the context of that pose. But that complexity is made way simpler by something like this. So, Miss Paris, would you mind firing up your camera feed? Go ahead and screenshot this. This is a relatively useful page to have at your disposal. And let's take on a 5-minute pose and have one leg in an easy position and another leg in a pain in the ass position. Maybe coming to and away from the camera at the same time. So maybe knee coming forward, ankle going back, but the other leg being straight. Doesn't matter whether or not it's from the front or the back. Yeah, perfect. And maybe let's just take that bent leg and just turn it a little bit more towards the outside. Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. Maybe that's even too much. Split the difference. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so again, and importantly, none of this shit changes the gesture. This is the same, right? Trying to simplify the complexity of the torso, right? Just by treating the torso as being trapped by the box of the arms, right? Because now the torso has to be inside of here, right? The pelvis has to be kind of like escaping on one side, right, versus the other. How much of that pelvis is escaping, right, kind of gives, or you get an idea by the center line. Simplifying this leg into a single movement, simplifying this leg into two-dimensional movements, made a little bit easier to position simply because we've got an idea of where those arms are. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, now, when we come into developing this area, we'll start with the legs because we're talking about the legs. First off, dividing this proportional. Right? Also, thinking about this as maybe being a bit more three-dimensional than two-dimensional. So I can kind of get a sense of how much perspective twist there is. This accentuates the perspective twist that's inside the pelvis already, right? By this side of the center line being a little bit closer to that edge than this. It's still thinking about the leg two-dimensionally in this case, coming over to this side of the leg. Right? Now starting to think about this three-dimensionally in this sense, even though we're in an unforeshortened position, because this is going to be useful for us to try to treat the leg as being incorporated with the side of the pelvis as well as the front of the pelvis. Because some of that leg stuff, right, your pelvic girdle is going to be existing something like that. Some of that leg stuff, you can see the indentation on this side as the glutes come in contact with the quads. Right? So your quads are kind of moving up like this to that rough midpoint, right? So your exterior quad is moving out over there. Other versions of your quads, and we'll get to this right at another point, are doing this, right? That big triangular, that big dividing muscle of your sartorius is coming up from here all the way to the inside of the knee. You can also see this nice straight line on the inside of the leg, right? As it inserts into the pelvis, that's your gracilis. And then the curve that's underneath it, that bulge here, these are your hamstrings. So those things are all stacking up on top of each other, and they're all coming down to where your kneecap is. Now, all of this, right, is still controlled by those basic shapes that we were talking about, just like this is being controlled by the basic shape of the leg as well. And then I can put in a convincing version of the leg like that. So that's no different than what we've done. The big difference would be is like, all right, well, this contour is going to be doing something like this now, right? And even more complicatedly, right, is going to be doing something more like that. And that contour is going to change depending on the position or the section of the leg that we're dealing with. Okay, so this becomes a really nice way of starting to develop volume inside this area by putting in, right, these changes of volume, or by putting in these changes of direction of those contour lines. Likewise, as we come out over here, you can treat this as the front of a box, essentially, which is always useful for the knee because the knee has a relatively flat appearance on the front of it. I can still divide this shape up diagonally. I can still put in the curve now that's on top of that there. And then kind of get a sense of the bulge of the hamstrings that would be inside this area. Now, from this point forward, I'm going to be doing stuff that we haven't talked about, right? But as a way of kind of introducing it, I'm just going to do it, and you guys can essentially try your hand at applying it. So what I'm doing here is laying in another muscle, laying in the same contour as it starts to be affected by the compression of the leg or compression of the chair up against it. And when I come down here, I'm now into dealing with a two-dimensional form again, because this is the easier way to deal with this section. And in every instance, I'm trying to make the job as easy as possible on myself. So irrespective of how much you know about this shit, it always suits your purposes to try to make this as easy as possible so that you have to do as little as possible in order to make your drawing feel as solid as possible. Okay, so now all of this, right, doesn't affect anything that resembles a detail. This is just a guideline for a detail. And so if I want to now make this detailed, I can now use this as a guideline to say, all right, well, that's where that edge line is going to be. I can also say that that's where this shadow, when we start dealing with shadow lines, is going to be, right? And use that as a rough guideline for where this shadow starts to develop as well, and why this muscle and this shadow is there. I can also start to exaggerate this stuff so that this now has to come in behind that. This has to come in front of that. And all of this has to go in front of this. Likewise, now that I've got this as a landmark, that becomes a landmark for my kneecap. And when I'm putting this stuff in, and the whole point and purpose of me doing this right now, right, is that I want you to recognize that even though I've only drawn certain lines, right, inside this area, all of this other stuff that I'm using to help develop the leg, this contributes to the leg feeling quote unquote finished. I'm not just drawing around every single line like this or every single area like this. This is just a standard way of us thinking about separating one thing from another thing, right? But doesn't really do a whole hell of a lot to improve the drawings. All it does is reinforces a way that we're consistent, or that we're used to thinking about things in terms of separating leg from surrounding environment, right? Or arm from torso, etc. Oh, hi, Miss Arwen. Hi, Miss Olive. Thank you, Paris. That was great. Okay, so in this next series of 5-minute poses, what I'd like you to try and do is, again, concentrate on just the legs, pelvis first, right? Then the torso afterwards, but go through the progression of 30s, 2s, right, etc. And then concentrate on this patterning and thinking about things 3-dimensionally, right, as much as possible when it's necessary in order to do that. But what I'd also like you to think about is try to avoid doing shit like this when you're outlining the pose. This is going to be a useful thing that we do at a certain point, but in a slightly different way. This is a default way of dealing with a line, right? And all this is going to do is make anything that you've done gestural or structural that looks really, really good, it's not going to make it look any better. It's just going to make it look darker. So we want to try to avoid this as a default. If anything, what we want is something, if you're going to put in a line, by all means, try it. But try to think about a line as just being a single stroke. And if you fuck it up, you fuck it up. Too bad. I mean, that's just part of the learning curve. Because what we want are lines that read with confidence at the end of the day, as opposed to lines that look like that. That's never going to look any different. These are going to get better, right, as you start to get better at applying them. Right? So the sooner we start trying that shit, the better off everybody's going to be, including myself, because my value as a person in the world is wrapped up inextricably with your value and your success, right, as a student. That's the symbiotic relationship that we now have. All right. How do we feel about that, gang? Feeling strong? Feeling good?
Great.
Yeah, no pressure. Don't fuck it up, guys. Last thing you want to see is me weeping on the other side of the camera. Right? See? Paris knows. Okay, gang. Thankfully, I recorded that section of the lecture. That's nice.